all here, and I'm glad it's a slightly nicer day today to have made your way here, if you have travelled to get here today. I'm delighted to be welcoming Professor Tim Hodgson to give his inaugural lecture in just a moment. I'm going to talk about how eye movements can change the world, which is a very exciting prospect. We're going to just have a short introduction by me, the head of the School of Psychology, Harriet Gross. Then Tim is going to give his talk, and then there will be an opportunity to ask some questions afterwards. And we will then go over for drinks and... Is it Leslie across the way?
In the atrium.
In the atrium, as usual. So for those of you who'd like to stay with us afterwards for a drink and continue talking to Tim about his work, I'm sure he'd be happy to do so. Tim joined us in 2011 from Exeter University, and he came here to be the Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience. Tim has been indefatigable in his efforts since he came here, so he's been a fantastic appointment from my perspective. So I'm really, really delighted that he's managed to find the time to do his inaugural lecture this year, because he's had an awful lot on, and he's been very busy helping us prepare for all sorts of things we're in the middle of. Tim did his first degree at Cardiff, somewhere near the sea. This is irrelevant for later. He then moved away from Cardiff and he went to do something like a real job, it looks like, in the flight simulation, which is unusual for academics to break out of the academic environment. He then decided that he had to go back and do something proper, so he went and did a PhD at Birkbeck, London University, nowhere near the sea. And his works then continued what he was interested in, which is cognitive and neural systems, brain systems involved in the control of eye movements and visual attention in the main. And that's the primary area of his research, but his publication as a professor has been very widely diverse in the sense that he's applied his skills and his knowledge in different areas. He's worked, he worked on a big Wellcome Trust project after his PhD, looking at ocular motor control, how we control eye movements. And then after he'd had a period working again in London, he moved down to Exeter, at least near the sea at last. And reputedly, apparently, quite a lot warmer than here in Lincoln. So he's had to make a transition by weather as well as by location. He established his career at Exeter, moving from lecturer to senior lecturer to associate professor before he joined us as a full professor, publishing very widely in academic journals specific to his area of specialism. He also has been very successful in attracting external funding from Wellcome Trust, from recently from the Technology Strategy Board and the MRC, but also from the Economic and Social Research Council. He's accumulated approximately £600,000 in grant income in the last few years, which is excellent and a good sign for us, so we're really delighted. He's also joined us as part of our growing team of researchers in the Perception, Action and Cognition group, and he's taken on an important role as research director in the School of Psychology, so I couldn't be more pleased to have Tim with us. What I will say, though, is that Tim is very hard-working, he's very committed and very energetic. And so he's a really good person to have around, but he does make you feel a bit lazy sometimes. When he arrived in Lincoln, we went out for a meal, and he put me and several other people at the table to shame by his assiduous work on knowing about Lincoln, and he'd only been here for a few weeks, in fact, only on a visit. And I've been here for several years, and some of the people at the table have been here forever and didn't know as much as Tim. So he clearly puts a lot of effort and time into finding things out and finding what's useful and interesting. And I think what we'll hear in his talk is about how he can put to use the things he's been discovering through his, as it were, day job as a researcher. So he knows a lot about the city. He knows where the best surfing beaches are. This is really crucial, and many of you may not think of Lincolnshire as a surfing location. As well as being able to run programme grants, and he's currently travelling between here and Exeter for his knowledge transfer partnership programme, which is funded by the MRC. He's travelling a lot. He's also found time to be in a band, which performed at a college event this year, and he proved himself a very able keyboard player. So we have very many multi-talented. And not only that, he this weekend he ran the 10K, and improved his time down to 53 minutes. So I think all in all, we have an all-rounder in our presence, and I'm sure we'll all be delighted to hear about the work that he does in the day job. I know for one's family, it's always really interesting to know what people do at work, and sometimes this is the only chance you get to find out. So over to you, Tim.
I have to say, it sounds absolutely exhausting, my life, doesn't it, I think? Well, thank you very much for that really flattering introduction, Harry, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends and family, for coming along today. I'm really, really flattered. So, as Harriet mentioned, I have quite diverse research interests. Another big area of research that I've been involved with over the last few years has been neuroimaging. That's imaging activity in the working brain using functional magnetic resonance imaging. But in fact today I'm going back to my roots and where I started out as an undergraduate student, being interested in the brain systems responsible for the control of our eye movements. And I want you to convince you that these are really exciting, interesting things in their own right, but also in at least 4 ways I'm going to focus on today, we can actually change the world in several senses of the expression, and eye movements are really important beyond academia in terms of our understanding and practical importance in doing useful things in the real world. So as I mentioned, I first got interested in these when I was an undergraduate at Cardiff University. One of my funnier tutors there was called Lawrence Harris, and he had a general interest in control systems in the brain. A particular type of eye movement I remember studying and first getting interested in there is called a saccade or a saccadic eye movement, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The word saccade comes from an old French word which means to pull or jerk, and in fact it's the origin of the word sack and satchel, because old cavalry men in the French army would have a bag called a sackière because they had to pull it shut with the draw cord. And that's what these movements look like. They're little jerks of the extraocular muscles that are attached to our eyeballs, and they move the point where you're looking from one place to another at very high velocity. We make a lot of these movements every day, up to 200,000 of these saccadic eye movements. They last a few tenths of a second, something like 50 milliseconds. The eyeball rotates in the orbit of the eye of speeds at up to 800 degrees of rotation per second. That means if these movements went on continuously, your eyeballs would be spinning around inside your head. Thankfully they don't. They stop in a very precise way, and you move from looking at one position to another, and this is a plot of the displacement of the eye against time for a series of saccadic eye movements here. The duration of those movements varies in a very systematic way with the size of the movements here. So they're like a sort of little neural machine inside your brain which controls these saccades. And in fact, we know what that machine looks like. There's a control circuit in the brain where we discovered the neurons who generate electrical activity in a very precise way that can move the extraocular muscles to generate a saccade, to move the eye from one place to another. Some of these figures are from a book by Roger Carpenter, who's a physiologist in Cambridge, another great inspiration for me, and wrote this fantastic book on the movements of the human eye, which explains a very complicated area in a very clear, interesting way. And another person to study saccades before me was a Russian physiologist called Yarbus, who wrote a book in the 60s, and he was one of the first people to measure these movements very precisely when people were looking at pictures. I'll come on to exactly how we do this later on. We're going to have an active demonstration, I hope. The way Yarbus was doing it was quite painful, but nowadays we can do it in a very nice way. And here's a famous picture. You'll see this in psychology textbooks of a little girl, and the little red lines show saccades when the viewer is moving to look from one position to another, and the blobs are where the eye is stationary, where you're seeing and fixating, but the lines between are the saccades when your eye is moving from one position to another. Now, you only actually see during these fixations when the eye is stationary. We don't actually see anything during saccades. I mentioned that we make about 200,000 of these movements every day, and they last about 50 milliseconds, but we don't actually see during this movement. So in fact, that means we're blind for about an hour and a half of every day. And yet most of you probably even haven't thought very much about eye movements. They don't really bother us, even though we don't see during them. And a lot of our waking life, these are actually causing problems. We don't actually see things during saccades. And that brings me on to the first way in which I think that eye movements literally change the world. Because the first sense in which they change the world is that they change the way we see the world. They create our perception of the world, and we all have a slightly different view of the world depending on how we're looking at it with our eyes. So if you were to look at this Van Gogh picture here, you can stare in the middle there, you get the impression of a whole picture, a whole painting. But in fact, the way our eyes work, we only have very precise, high-quality vision in the centre of our field of view. And all around is, in fact, blurry. We don't have very good quality vision out here. And in fact, the way we see colour as well is a bit different. So if we were to show what we were really looking at, what the brain can see, if you like, it would look much more like this. We only see clearly at the point in which we're looking. And a few years ago, I did a collaborative project with an artist called Robin Hawes, who was at University College Falmouth at the time. He's now at Cardiff University. And we measured eye movements when people are looking at pictures with the idea that everybody paints their own picture of the world by the way they use saccades to look at it. And so we created this picture. This is one of Robin's images that he's created, one of his art images. It happens to be of a picture of the iris of the eye, and this is the image we chose. And then we measured where people looked at this picture over the course of 20 seconds or so when we showed it on a screen, and we recorded their eye movements. And what you see is that they all have their own picture that they create depending on where they look. So over here is a sequence of saccades as they viewed this picture. And then what we did is transform that to create a picture where it was only in high resolution clear, a picture where at the points where each person was looking. So what effectively you get is a series of individual views of the world which are changed by the way the person is scanning that image. And that's what I'm showing you here. Different people looking at that picture and, if you like, painting their own picture of the world by the different way in which they looked at it over the course of 20 seconds. The project was called Private View because we all have our private perception and view of the world that we create with our saccades. But in fact, it's not just perception of the world that's influenced by where we're looking and our saccades. I would argue that it's the way we think about the world. It's cognitive processes as well that not only influence how we look at things, but eye movements actually influence the way we think and act in the world in that more complex way. Now, if you remember that picture of the little girl from Yarbus, that's the picture you see in all the psychology textbooks. But in fact, it's a picture which doesn't really tell the whole story. And there's another picture that Yarbus has in his book, another experiment that he did, that I think makes a better point about saccades. And this time, there's a picture here. It's called The Soldier's Return, I think, or something like that, The Stranger Returns or something. And he asked people, well, just to view that picture, as we were doing before, and recorded the pattern of saccades. But then he asked them different questions about the picture, such as how long has the soldier been away, or something like that, or how young or old are the people in the picture, are they rich or poor? Depending upon the instructions, the questions that are being asked, you get very different patterns of eye saccades when viewing the same image. So it's not just a case of our eyes being attracted by obvious things, although sometimes in the case of viewing a face, you do tend to look at the eyes and the nose and obvious things there, but in fact they're heavily influenced by cognitive processes as well. And a few years ago in my research, we showed a similar sort of thing in a more sophisticated way, and we presented people with some puzzles on a computer screen. And this is a puzzle that's based upon a children's game called the Tower of Hanoi. I don't know if you've ever seen this, where you have discs which you put onto pegs and you have to arrange them in a certain way. And we have a variant of this where these coloured balls, you have to imagine these are balls in pockets. And what you have to do is rearrange the balls down here to match what you see up here. So this is a simple one. You just move the ball out here, the red one over there, and move it back. We gave people these puzzles, and they just had to think about how you would solve that problem. They weren't actually using a touch screen or moving those balls around, but we measured their eye movements, and the way they moved their eyes reflected the way they were thinking about solving the problems there in a very clear way. But more than that, when we gave them these very difficult ones here, so we've got 5 balls, we've got to think about how to rearrange these down here to match this configuration, we found that people that were good at completing these problems were very efficient at the way they used their eye saccades and directed them precisely to the right bit of the problem that was crucial to solve them. In many cases, it was moving this blue ball in the wrong direction and then back to the right direction. But people that got stuck and found these problems very difficult, they weren't directing their attention and their eye movements to the right place. So saccades are influenced by cognitive processes and vice versa. The way cognitive processes work are going to be influenced by the way we direct attention. Now that's quite interesting, that quite an important part of vision and how we interact with the world is this motor, this active component of vision that often we don't think about. We tend to think about vision being about the eye. But one upshot of this leads me into the next way I think that eye movements could change the world and can change the world. And that's that if we use them more efficiently and we can help people to use them better, we can actually make things better when there's problems with vision. So eye movements could make the world a better place for adults and children that suffer from visual problems, visual impairment. In order for you to understand how this works, I need to do a little mini lecture on the visual system of the brain. Information comes out of the retina of the eye and is sent up to the back part of the brain here, but it's not a case of the left eye sending signals to the right side of the brain and the right eye sending signals to the left side of the brain. In fact, both eyes send information to both halves of the brain, but it's the whole left visual field that will go to the right side, and the whole right visual field of each eye will go to the left side of the brain. And there's this crossover point where half the information crosses over at this point called the optic chiasma. The reason why I'm telling you this is depending upon the type of injury you might have had as a result of a stroke or of a neurological problem, it will lead to partial blindness even though your eyes are intact. There's nothing wrong with the retina or the eyeballs itself, but you'll get partial visual loss depending on where these pathways are damaged. So you get a problem here, well, you're just going to lose vision from one eye. That's straightforward. A problem here at the optic chiasma, the crossing point, you'll actually lose vision from the peripheral fields on both sides. Often, in fact, that's a sign there might be a tumour growing underneath the optic chiasma. Pituitary gland tumours are often noticed initially in that way. The patients I've done some work with previously tend to have this problem, though. They'll have damage higher up the visual pathway such that they lose vision on one half of space, on one half of their visual field from both eyes. That's got a funny name to it. It's called a homonymous hemianopia. We'll just call it hemianopia for now. Now that sounds like a a fairly, not too serious a problem really. You've got a good vision there, half your visual field's okay. Surely that's not a big problem. In fact, from my experience, patients that suffer from hemianopia, partial visual loss, find it absolutely devastating, and it can really have a massive effect on their everyday lives. Now, one obvious area where it's a problem is doing something simple like reading, especially if you lose vision on the opposite side here. So damage over here can lead to problems on the right. And I've got a little video to show you here, which should make the point. This is a playback using some old software I programmed on the Mac when I was doing my PhD, so it's a bit fuzzy, excuse me. But this is showing you in a similar way to those Yarbus pictures what these patients tend to do if YouTube is behaving itself. Yeah, so the red line shows where people are looking, and it's not working. Clearly we've got a YouTube issue. Let's try it again. Yeah, it's working now. So the little red line, in this case, is someone who's absolutely fine, and they're just reading 5 words of text that we showed on the computer screen. The little red line is showing where they're looking with the eyes. It's slightly slowed down, but essentially to make 4 or 5 fixations here to fixate the words in a precise way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The eye tracker we were using here was a little bit out of date, but it makes the point. Okay, and I think it's here. And I'll show you now what happens if you have a hemianopia. So they're doing the same thing, just reading across 5 words of text. It is slightly slowed down, the playback, but not by much. But you can notice, well, what do you notice? It's much slower, and there's many more movements going on here. And they're almost reading the text in a letter-by-letter way, certainly syllable by syllable. I'll show you one more. So lots of little saccades and eye movements rather than just one per word. That's actually a blink. Okay. Keep this going. And you'll see also that the eyes go back on themselves, which normal reading that wouldn't happen as well. I'll stop that there. This picture here shows that in graph form here. So here's somebody with a visual field loss on the right and a very slow, make lots of saccades, and this is what it should look like, okay? But it's not just reading that might be affected by this type of visual loss. We often have to look for things. I'm always losing things. We're all always losing things. I often find it hard to find things in the supermarket. I don't seem to be able to look very efficiently for things. And looking for a book on the shelf is another difficult task that we need to shift our attention, our eye movements, and use saccades for. So I want you to do a little task here. I want you to tell me how many of these T-shapes you can count in this screen. And they're quite hard to find, and you have to use your saccades to do it. Are you looking? 14. I think 19. I think there's probably 19 there. I think that's probably right. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because those T-shapes don't jump out at you. You have to use your saccades to look for them. Now, if you were good at that, you'll be doing it in quite a systematic way. I just want to show you what happens when you have a certain type of brain injury. The first video here is showing you somebody doing what most of you were doing here, just searching through that screen to find, and YouTube is really not behaving itself very well. Trust me to rely on YouTube. So here's the pattern of saccades as they're searching through, looking for all those T's. Here we go. You see there's a strategy there, isn't there? An ordered sequence going from left to right, up to down, up, down, and they found all the T's. They actually press a little key when they find one. Here's somebody else doing it. And what do you notice about this? The starting out on the right, there's a very odd way of approaching it, isn't it? They're not looking over to the left at all. But not only that, they go repeating themselves, they're losing track of where they're searching. They're going back over and over and repeating that path. So they're very inefficient. And that patient actually had had a stroke, not affecting the visual cortex, but in fact affecting the parietal lobe here, and was suffering from a disorder called hemispatial neglect. So, even though the visual system is basically intact, the eyes are okay, and even the early parts of the brain's visual system are fine, you can still get this type of problem with active components of vision. So that's a graph showing the same thing. There is a possible way of making this better, and that is to train patients to use their eye saccades more effectively to compensate for their hemianopia or even this problem known as neglect. And a few years ago, that's what we did. We took a bunch of people that had hemianopia from various different causes, stroke or other sorts of brain injury. They're a mixed bag of people, but they all had this partial visual loss. And then we got them to do these visual search tasks on the computer, similar to the ones I was just showing you, but in fact there was always just an odd one out in the picture, like this, or sometimes there wasn't a target there. And they did this at home over the course of a month. In fact, we got them to do an awful lot of this type of task, several tens of thousands of trials on it. Okay, so it's very boring, but in fact it worked. And when we measured their performance on other tasks and also asked them, just were you finding things better, in a number of areas their vision improved significantly as a result of this training program. The problem is it's incredibly boring, people don't like doing it, and it's certainly no good for children that have visual impairment. They're not going to bother with this at all. You could just about persuade adults to engage with this and keep going with it. A lot of them really didn't like it, even though it was making them better. And the exciting thing is we've just got this new grant to actually take this basic idea forward, and this is in collaboration with an organisation called the West Foundation, that are a specialist centre for visual impairment based down in Exeter, and work with children with visual loss. And together with Conor Linehan in the Lincoln Social Computing Group, who's up there, we're prosecuting this Knowledge Transfer Partnership grant. And the idea is to deliver a computer game, a fun game that could do the same sort of thing and improve functional vision in children. But we think there will be benefits in adults as well. So we're going to gamify visual search training for children with cerebral visual impairment. So that's what we're doing. Now, there's going to be a little bit of an interlude here. I think we're all right for time. And you may be wondering how you actually measure these movements, and there's lots of different ways in which we can do it. Yarbus was doing this sort of thing, which is horrible. He was attaching contact lenses to people's eyes using a suction cup and measuring eye movements in this type of way. This is the system I've used for that private view project and other projects. This is the latest version of this video-based eye tracking technology I'll come on to next. But this is a fun system, highly portable, that's invented by Jan Ober, who's a professor from the Polish Academy of Sciences there, who's over visiting us for reasons I'll explain later on in the lecture. But as he was over here, and he brought this fantastic portable eye tracking machine, I thought it'd be fun just to have a little demonstration. But for that, I need a volunteer. And I will give a prize for a volunteer. And the prize is a copy of a book that we produced with Robin Hawes on the Private View project, and a flick book there. So can I get any willing volunteers just to sit down here, and we'll do a quick eye tracking so you can see saccades in the lecture? Probably not. Will you do it? Come on then. Oh, we got a volunteer here. I was going to pick on someone at the back there, but she's got away with it. I'll put the lights up. Shouldn't take long. And where's the eye track? Is he going to? Oh, there you are. Yeah, the eye track's going to help me. I'll put the lights up. So, and shouldn't take long. Let's put the lights up here. That's it. What's your name? Marguerite. Thank you very much for volunteering there. We're just putting this little headband on Marguerite's head there, and all it does is it's got little sensors which can detect infrared invisible light, and it can detect where the light and dark area of your eyes are moving when you're making saccades. And I've got to switch to the laptop view, haven't I? There we are. And you see these little laser spots up here? Look down here. There we are. And we're going to get Marguerite just to make saccades following that little laser spot. And those lasers are mounted on her head there. And up at the top here, we should see something. Is it working? Yes, you don't look at the screen, Marguerite. You'll have to look down here. You'll be the one person that doesn't see your own saccades. So you keep looking down here at the laser spot. And every time that laser spot jumps, you can see the saccades happening up there. And in fact, it gives you a very rapid result. That latency over there is how quickly she's moving her eyes to respond. The little yellow cross is showing you how she's looking to the left and right. And you can see they're very quick, some of these responses, under a fifth of a second. That's it. We'll do a couple more. There we are. Great. So it's that easy. And the fantastic thing is this system is so portable. It's even been taken up Everest by Jan and his team to measure how the brain might be affected by altitude.
Can you just explain latency and duration?
So the latency is how quickly the eyes are moving from a standing start. The duration is how long that movement you can see lasts. So the duration in milliseconds is when the eye's moving, and the latency is the reaction time. So the time between the laser spot jumping and Marguerite moving her eyes. But that's great. You can finish that. Thank you so much for volunteering. Here's your prize, which is a flip book of the Private View project. Thank you very much. That's great. Thanks. Brilliant. Okay. I thought that worked rather well. Thank you, particularly to Jan and Jacek for coming over. Okay. That's it. So the picture here is of me. There's a picture of me. Here's a picture of me at something called the Summer Scientist Week that we have in Lincoln University in the School of Psychology. And this is great. This is a real revelation to me when I came to Lincoln last year, and it's a fantastic thing that we do in the School of Psychology. What we do is every year for a week, we get about 200 school kids into the School of Psychology. They range in age from 3 or 4 up to 12. And we work with them and participate in research with us, collaborate in research with us to understand how the brain develops. And this year was the first time I had a chance to do this. And so what I did is I thought I'd see what they do with their eye saccades. And we invented a little game for them to play on the computer at Summer Scientist. I was particularly interested in how children respond to this type of thing, where somebody else is looking with their eyes, where someone's pointing with their fingers. And how do they respond to road signs, arrows, and symbols that we see around us? How does that affect the way they're looking? And that was a research question I was interested in. But children, because they're quite sensible, they don't really want to do anything too boring. So, can you hear a buzzing? No, this is Buzzy Bee. So instead of getting them to look at a laser spot, I got them to look at Buzzy Bee as he was jumping around the screen. And I should have another YouTube clip here. It's behaving itself. So here's one of our kids doing the task. They just have to look at Buzzy Bee, but these pictures are coming up in the middle, and sometimes they're a bit distracting because Buzzy Bee went that way, and the eyes or the arrows were pointing the other way, and wanted to see how quickly or slowly they responded under these different conditions and see how that varies with age. So there's a little experiment we did last summer. I just wanted to share the results with you now. And this graph shows what happened. And we've got 2 different types of trial here. Sometimes it's congruent, so the arrow pointed in the same direction as Buzzy Bee jumped. Sometimes it's incongruent, so the arrow or the eyes or the fingers pointed in the opposite direction. What you can see is it slows you down in terms of that saccadic latency or response time, so you're slower to follow Buzzy Bee when the arrows or the eyes point in the opposite direction. But particularly for these young children, 4 or 5-year-olds, they were really strongly influenced by the fingers pointing, but not the other types of cue. And that seemed to develop over time, such that the older children were more influenced by all the different types of cue. We think that's a really interesting result. This is shown here again, the same thing, showing how that effect develops over time. So it's the younger children that were most influenced by these fingers, and on the incongruent trials where the fingers point in the opposite direction to Buzzy Bee. Yeah, get it? Well, I had a PhD student who's particularly interested in this topic, and she's quite a humble sort of person. But I've encouraged her, again, to think about how these type of results might change the world, might be useful, might be interesting. And she published a paper last year based on similar findings we had in adults. And she gave the paper a very funny title, which I approved of, Giving Subjects the Eye and Showing Them the Finger, Biological Cues and Saccade Generation in the Anti-Saccade Task, which I thought was great. And she said this in the paper: traditional road signs in the UK are known as finger posts and were originally shaped as pointing hands. Interestingly, the current work shows that arrows may not influence the oculomotor system as effectively as pointing fingers, suggesting that transport signage designers might consider reinstating traditional finger posts to more effectively direct action and attention on the highway. And one or two of the reviewers thought this was a bit far-fetched, but the editor loved this, and so we kept it in. So another way in which eye movements might change the world in the future is they might bring back these old-fashioned finger posts. Why not? You know, if pointed fingers are really the best way of directing attention, why don't we bring them back? There's no reason why they went. Some of you might recognise this one. It's down in the Cotswolds, just outside Chipping Campden. Okay, but yeah, a bit tongue-in-cheek. But actually, I think there's possibly serious research to be done there about how we improve the effectiveness of signage in our environment and what are the best cues to direct attention. Now, the last bit of the lecture today, I want to go back to the brain. And I want to go back to the future of signage. And don't be scared by this diagram. All I want to show you here is that the way the brain systems that we know about controlling eye movements, we understand them really well. We've got this map of the brain and all the different parts of the brain that are involved in controlling these things called saccades. It just happens that there's been a lot of research, not just my contribution's just a small one into this area, but over the decades we've charted the control of these movements because they're particularly precise, accurate movements. We understand them quite well. So all of these systems are involved and more. Now, the advantage of that is that when things go wrong in the nervous system and the brain, we can often see signs of that in eye movements. Here's an example from some of my research. Here's a patient who suffers from multiple sclerosis, and they've got a tiny area, a tiny lesion. It's actually where you've lost myelin in the nervous system. You can see there highlighted in part of this system in the brain stem. And what happened was they have this ocular flutter. So here's a saccade, and this is abnormal. The eyes go a bit wobbly at the end of the saccade, and we were able to measure that and show that was a real effect. A month or so later, she was in remission, and you can see that lesion has disappeared. And in fact, that effect, that problem with the eye movements, had also disappeared. So we have quite a precise idea of what different parts of the brain are doing, and often we can see those problems in eye saccades. I'll give you some other examples. There's a really clear effect in Parkinson's, whereby saccades, for the most part, are absolutely fine and look normal speed and response. But if you get someone with Parkinson's to follow a sequence of movements from memory rather than looking at a laser spot as we were doing there, that's where you see what's called multi-stepping, this jerkiness of saccades. So they've reduced size compared to a person without Parkinson's. And it's quite a distinctive feature, and that's to do with the brain circuits that are affected in Parkinson's. Those are the ones involved in this type of voluntary eye movement. Another study here. I don't want to overwhelm you with stuff. I think I'm just making a point. Here's a study of Huntington's patients. Now, this is a horrible disease because you're sort of pre-programmed to get it, and you can actually analyse the genetic markers in people that haven't developed the disease, in family members of those that have, and even in those patients that were pre-symptomatic, so they had the genetic mutation for Huntington's. What we see is that their saccadic eye movements are slowed in terms of their latency or response time. So we could detect that with a system like Jan's, where we're looking at the speed of response. And then finally, another important, massive issue for the country really is dementia, and increasingly it's going to be a problem. And in fact, saccades could be used as a measure of problems in Alzheimer's. And a task I've used a lot in my research, though this isn't my research here, is called the anti-saccade task. And this is simply, rather than looking at the spot, rather than looking at the laser as it jumped left or right, we ask people to look away, make a movement away from that target, and that's what we call an anti-saccade. And people with Alzheimer's will make more errors in that task. And they're not obvious sorts of errors. Most of us will make mistakes where we make a saccade and quickly correct it. In Alzheimer's, they tend not to correct, so they don't make a second movement to look in the opposite direction, because it's quite hard to stop yourself looking at things that flash up in front of you. So this leads me into the final reason why I think that eye movements could change the world, and I think it's the most important, exciting reason, is there's potential here that we could use eye movements not just in terms of assessing neurological problems, but they're certainly very important for that because we understand the brain systems involved in their control so clearly. But we could actually use them as a tool to provide an earlier diagnosis of neurological disease, including Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And I spent the day today over in the think tank centre talking about developing a research project to look at whether this might be a practical, useful thing to do in, say, a GP practice where we'd take Jan's brilliant invention, this portable eye tracker, run some very quick tests to give people reassurance, perhaps that there's no problem, people that might be worried that they might be developing a neurological problem, but also pick up early signs. There might be something that we should look into and refer them for some more specialist assessment and intervention. So that's the last big reason, I think, how eye movements could, in the future, change the world. And we've currently got a research project proposal under consideration for funding on that. So here's what it would look like with Jan's tracker there. And we'd do a battery of little tests similar to the ones Marguerite was doing there, following a little laser spot on the screen. So, can eye movements change the world? Well, I hope I've convinced you that in a number of ways they certainly do. They change our perceptions of the world, the way we think about the world, but in practical sense they can make things better for people that have neurological problems and compensate for visual problems of a brain-based origin. They might even change road signs, who knows? But the thing that I'm most excited about is possibly using them to detect early onset of neurological problems as well. So the answer to that, I think, would be yes, definitely, probably, maybe in the future. And also, in lots of other ways I haven't mentioned, and you might want to ask me about some of those as well. I just took a selection based upon some of my own research work, but I think there are other things potentially out there as well. So, thank you very much for coming and listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Shall we put the lights up so we're not sitting in semi-darkness? Well, I think, thank you very much for that. I certainly found that very interesting. It's great to hear what people do. I just see them in their office or asking me for money. And now I know why they are. I'm sure some people might have questions, so please put your hand up and either shout out or
there's a
bring
microphone.
the microphone if you can't hear. Yes.
Oh, is it on?
I'm interested in the very last part.
Yes.
We're going to match this eye movement with diagnostics.
Yes.
Yeah? Now, you said it was...
It's working, I think. Yeah.
That's right. I don't usually have a problem with the volume of my voice. That's just the opposite. But you were looking at neurodegenerative diseases in one form or another. But there are lots of diseases that can affect the eye. With simple things like macular degeneration or even diabetes.
Yes.
So I'm just interested as to how well you can match some a movement pattern
yes.
with a particular type of disease?
Well, in terms of those...
There's a lot of noise in the background, I think, is what I'm coming from.
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. And for the sake of evaluating their effectiveness, what we'll probably do initially is actually not select people that have obvious problems, certainly binocular visual problems, okay? So that may be a problem for the approach, but we can evaluate that by just comparing people that don't with those that do. But in terms of macular degeneration, eye movements are important because, again, there are ways of compensating for that potentially with the sort of training approaches that I showed you. There's certainly disorders that affect the extraocular muscles themselves. They're quite rare, I think. So there would be another sort of whole set of problems that are more obviously to do with the eye and the control of the eye. But I guess what I'm saying, I'm more interested in those more neurological problems at a higher level that aren't obviously visual or oculomotor, but nevertheless we can detect them using these saccade tests. I think what we're going to do is look at it in practice and see how much of an issue this is. Any sort of visual problem doesn't exclude you from doing these tests and shouldn't necessarily produce a problem on them, but certain types of condition, such as macular degeneration, are going to be a problem for that type of assessment. But they would be for anything you're doing, any sort of cognitive testing as well is going to interfere, those sort of conditions are going to interfere with that. Is that an answer for you?
I think broadly that's all right. I'm just thinking of, your suggesting of the GP's office.
Yeah.
Somebody sits down and does the eye test.
Yes.
You've then got to match the outcome of that test.
Yes.
With some disorder.
Yes.
And if there's a lot of kind of background noise just in eye, things that affect the eyes rather than a brain issue.
Yeah.
I don't quite see how you decouple the two.
Well, it's a problem for...
It's something which is abnormal, but you're not
Yeah.
going to be able to match that with a particular...
Well, I think the key is that we've got to do the research to compare people with clearly visual problems without. So we'll record that in the research, what actual front-end sort of visual problems they would have. But something certainly would preclude them from that sort of testing and make it ineffective. But that would be the case actually with a lot of other stuff that's out there, simple pencil and paper sort of assessments of cognitive function as well. It would be an issue with that too. But thanks for the question, yeah.
The typical academic answer, more research needed.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
Recently I went to the opticians and I actually had a test which was quite similar to that.
Mm.
Is there not already on the market some equipment that can do that?
That's another good point, because another possible venue for this type of thing would be alongside a visual assessment in an optician, in fact. But it's not what that test is about. That's not what it's being used for at the moment. But it could be. And so, that's one place in which it might end up in 10 years' time if things work, that actually, as well as going for a test to get new spectacles, you might do a quick test of eye movements, and actually we could, if there are any anomalies, the computer might sort of refer you back to the GP. So it's possible, but it's almost in the realm of science fiction at the moment. But the technology's there, but the research isn't.
From an educational psychology point of view, is this something being used to kind of diagnose and see the effects in people with dyslexia?
Certainly. Okay, so it was a question about whether eye movement research would be useful in understanding problems in dyslexia. It's going slightly beyond my realm of knowledge in the area, but certainly I'm sure that there's research out there that looks at eye tracking in dyslexia and the differences between people with dyslexia and without. But I can't give you the actual answer. I'd have to go and look up the papers for you, which I'm happy to do. Drop me an email.
Okay, who again?
I work as an orthoptist at Lincoln County Hospital.
Oh, great, yeah.
I work with children who are referred and adults with dyslexia.
Yeah.
Or thought to have dyslexia.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of work with oculomotor control.
Yeah.
And visual perception.
There we go.
We've just finished auditing our patients for last year who came up to the clinic. And it was really interesting to see how by improving
Brilliant.
It's also been really interesting to see how by improving visual perception we can make a marked difference to reading ability. I heard you speak at the BOM group in Liverpool
Oh,
last
yes.
January.
Yes, yes.
One of
The British Oculomotor Group, is this? Yeah.
the things you said was that patients with Parkinson's disease
Yeah.
may find it hard to learn new visuospatial tasks.
Right. Yes, yes.
May I ask you, please,
Yeah.
what would be your view in the benefit of trying to improve visual perception skills in somebody with Parkinson's? Do you think there's enough research to be fair to a
Yeah.
patient to suggest
Well,
it, or is it giving false?
I think that's running ahead a bit. I mean, what we're trying to do in Parkinson's, there's two things that my research has looked at. First is this oculomotor marker. I think that's really interesting in potentially discriminating Parkinson's from other conditions, so this multi-stepping of the eye movements. But we're also interested in cognitive processes in Parkinson's, and some of the people at the front here know because I came to talk to them about it recently as well. And there are some quite subtle cognitive problems in Parkinson's which are sort of separate to the eye movement area, and they're not fully understood, but generally it's about learning new tasks and switching between different tasks. Seems to be a situation where you can find that Parkinson's patients are slightly worse than people without Parkinson's. But it's by no means fully understood why that might be, whether it's a feature of the disease itself or whether indeed it might be a side product of medication used to treat the motor symptoms of the disease. But that's another, I could have done another talk actually on cognitive function in Parkinson's and stroke as well, because it's a whole other area I'm interested in. I'm a little bit nervous about, well, okay, what harm could it do to say you might experience some problems like this in your everyday life? We're quite interested in finding out more from people with Parkinson's about the sort of areas they find difficult beyond just the obvious problems with movement. And that sort of research could be done with a questionnaire type evaluation, just asking people what sort of areas of life they find problematic.
Could I just ask you to put into simple English what she was talking about?
Yeah.
She was talking, a bit higher than most of us. Could
Yeah.
you give us an example of what she meant?
In terms of everyday tasks,
Yeah.
well, I mean, one thing would be, say, in the kitchen, you're switching between making a cup of tea and then switching to, cooking your dinner. I mean, learning a new program on a computer. Perhaps you might be a bit slower to do that, or switching between different tasks on a computer. That may be the sort of thing that's particularly subtly affected.
I've got another point. I'm
Yeah.
vice chair of the Lincolnshire.
Yeah, no, I know you will, yeah.
When we get assessed for neurological conditions, we go to a GP and then we go to somebody else. Neurology, we might be lucky, or orthopedics or somewhere like that. They history take, they do some basic manual muscle testing, single action, grip my finger, pull against me, push against me, which only tests that muscle at that time. It doesn't test pattern of movement, sustaining or repetitive power. And that's about it. So this is an additional test which is going to give... I've spent 7 years being told there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got Lloyd George syndrome on my GP records. I don't know whether there's anybody here that knows what that is. It's actually the brown envelope your records were kept in was called a Lloyd George, and there was too much in mine that was all in my mind. Well, that's what Lloyd George syndrome is. But when I found out that I had polio as a child, and when I found out that there was something called post-polio syndrome, there was a later stage to it, then I went back to the doctors and said, well, look, have a look at this. And all of a sudden, my low back pain changed to post-polio syndrome. But the form of assessment, and it goes, we talk about this in our neurological meetings, we're just getting is basic history taking, few simple tests, you might get a little bit of something else. You're not getting anything that sort of directs you. We know people with Parkinson's who've gone 4 years, 7 years before they've been picked up. So
Yeah,
if
I
there's
think that's
something
right,
else that says, look, there is a neurological
Yeah.
issue, then you can get further testing. So that's your comment,
That's right. I mean, this sort of testing would, to date, I've been working in research groups or specialist research centres. That's the only place you'd have a proper assessment of your saccades. So, yeah, we're trying to take that leap and get it more as a more regular thing that might even be done in primary care. And if we do the research properly, then we'd be able to make recommendations for what are the best sort of indicators that there might be a problem. But certainly if you've got that sort of multi-stepping or big saccadic, that flutter effect at the end, that's obvious actually. You should see that at a bedside test, but there may be more subtle things that we can do with this technology. So,
yes, question.
Staying with this theme of Parkinson's and the multi-stepping, what you would need to develop now would be a cohort study, wouldn't it? To get people before they ever developed Parkinson's to see over time whether that pattern emerges before any diagnosis.
Well, specifically for Parkinson's, I think that sort of thing is going on. But that's what the research I'm proposing is currently on a smaller scale, to, not just for Parkinson's, but to do a cohort where we follow people through. So we test them on a bunch of these tasks after 400 people, and then we follow them up over the course of a few years. And actually, the law of odds, some of them will actually be diagnosed with neurological problems, some of them with Parkinson's, and then we can go back and look at what the tests were showing a few years before. So that's basically exactly what we want to do.
You'd be able to do that to get predictability.
Yes, yeah, and we could follow them through. It could be data that could be kept sort of on file for years to come and could be followed up at several stages. So.
Do we have any other questions? Roderick?
You made a link between eye movements and cognition. Is there some work on link between eye movement and emotions?
Yeah. Again, you're putting me on the spot here. That question could be answered in lots of different ways. For example, I've been involved in research looking at how the pattern of eye movements people make when they're looking at a face varies depending upon the emotion expressed in that face or upon some other emotional sort of intervention, as it were. Somebody put somebody in a particular emotional state or prime them with emotional information and see how that affects the way they will sort of extract emotion from a face. So that sort of research I've been slightly involved in. As to whether you can read emotion from sort of activity with the eyes, is that more your question? I think that's more dubious. That eye movements themselves would be an indicator of emotional state is more problematic. Yeah.
You could explain that.
Yeah, well, I think it's been sort of done. There is stuff out there which, one version of this talk I had a slide on it. There's a lot of stuff out there about, eye movements to the left and eye movements up and down indicate you're thinking about the visual stuff or auditory stuff or even sort of emotional state or whether you're lying or not. That is really quite pseudoscientific stuff, and everything that's looked into that area has tended to show there's very little or nothing in that type of reading people's minds from where they're moving their eyes. So I'll throw that one in.
Yes.
We're told that the advertising industry is interested in where you look.
Mm-hmm.
Do you manage to get any money out of the advertising industry?
Well, I have done. When I was younger, I did do some work with the poster advertising industry as a way of sort of supplementing my income during my PhD. But it's actually something you really need to be sort of connected with the right people. They tend to be based in London, and so I haven't opened up that income stream. But I think it is something that we should be looking at. Yeah, we should be, yeah. So I don't know whether there's any advertising industries in Lincoln, but they should be interested if they're not already.
Might be just one interesting point. There's a road sign on the way to East Midlands Airport at a roundabout under the flyover where they've got an aeroplane, but it's pointing in the wrong aeroplane. It's pointing in the wrong direction.
Oh, that's really, yeah. So the aeroplane's flying that way and the sign to the airport's going that way.
You've got to go straight.
You're all over the place.
Every time I've seen it,
Because your eyes would go...
you're just thinking you've got to go this way.
They would.
You've got to go that way.
There we go.
I think that's a perfect
That's brilliant.
example. I think that's a perfect example. Do we have any other questions?
Oh, yeah.
thank
Oh, thank you.
for doing things like this. As a Parkinson's sufferer, it's reassuring to know
Yeah.
that these people out there doing it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. It was nice to see all these familiar faces then.
Okay, I think we'll call it a day. I'm sure Tim will be happy to talk to people in the atrium in food. I have to finish this up by just announcing the next talk for those of you who might be interested. But I first of all just like to thank Tim again for his very interesting. Just to remind you, this is part of the Lincoln Academy
Oh,
lecture. Oh,
sorry. I pressed the wrong button.
I'm now getting to my lecture. This is part of the Lincoln Academy lecture series, and the next one of these that will be happening is on Tuesday the 30th of April, when Professor Judy Alsop will be talking about Jonathan's tale continued, professionalism versus state regulation, something that perhaps a number of us are concerned about at the moment, so look forward to that. But again, thank you very much for coming to Tim's talk, and please join us in the atrium, which is just across the way from here. I'm sure you'll follow people as you go.
Jan is this genius inventor. So when a beauty of the idea is that the eye books. Have a book. You can have that. Yeah. So,
Could that be taken into port as far as eyewitnesses and ambulance? I didn't have the confidence to ask before. mix up what you see.
That's right.
Loud and water. People are possibly sensitive based on something. Does that not throw that system into...
A little bit, yeah, but how you'd... I mean, that has to rely on something, doesn't it? But it is true that visual perception is not as solid a thing as perhaps is often taken to be, and that people see things that aren't there, and they also don't see things that are there an awful lot of the time. And when you just, the basic understanding, this is sort of stuff we take for granted in the scientific world, you know, that this is the way vision works, but you're right, there are big implications for that, but we only have quite a selective perception, and in fact, this vivid sort of very detailed world is...
over 20%, you actually don't see.
Yeah, that's right, yeah, I mean, that makes the point, doesn't it, that graph there, that you're only really using a tiny, that's the retina, your field of view, and it's only that bit in the middle that you get the good quality vision for, and all around is sort of blurry, so you would miss things in the periphery. But how you would take that on into, you know, you can basically question anything. I think just the, you know, everything has to be judged on the basis of that basic knowledge that perception isn't perfect. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
The more
Or
we
that they
learn
didn't
about
see
the
them.
eye, there's certainly scope for that to take into a course.
I suppose a course of law would just take the weight of evidence. So if several people have seen something, then that totally
But then if
strengthens
those
it.
several people have got their own unique subjective,
Yeah,
it
that's
throws
right.
it all. It's definitely... Well, thanks for your Timmy.
That's right.
Thanks
for coming. Oh, great, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good, yeah. Have you got one of those? Do you want?
I have got, I think I have two of these now actually. Do you want to, are you taking them back in your bag?
Right. Well, it was about the right length, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. You had a bit, so you had time for your doing your videos, because otherwise you were going to be after.
Yeah. So,
Excellent.
yes, I cut a bit out. Yes. So it just says to me something. Doing all this stuff or something.
I know, well it just...
Rushing around the country going surfing and running.